All right, today we're talking about the Revel Ranger.
Fine as you wanna, what I'm supposed to do. Something told me got time to lose. Go ahead and bust a move.
So this bike is pretty new. It's maybe 2 years old, but it already seems to have this really big cult following. On paper, it blurs the lines between a traditional XC bike and kind of a trail bike. You know, it has the geometry of an XC bike, but it has a little bit more travel, kind of puts it into that trail bike category. So how does it fare out on the trail? Stick around to find out. So you might have to listen to a couple birds. It's too nice of a day to be inside the garage with the door shut, so I've got it wide open here. Just deal with the birds. Let's start this off by saying I'm not XC race guy. I've done one XC race, it was like 4 years ago, so I'm not going to even pretend to know the first thing about cross-country racing. I'm more of a let's ride bikes for fun kind of guy. So if you want the XC expert review of the Ranger, you're gonna have to look elsewhere. But if you want a fresh take from an average Joe, this will be your review. So let's set the stage before we dive into how this thing rides. We're gonna talk about a couple of key features. The Ranger has 29-inch wheels, has 115 millimeters of rear travel, 120 up front. And because I always forget to do this, I am 6 feet 2 inches tall and I am riding an extra large. The Ranger is the steepest and shortest bike that I have ridden in the past who knows how long. It has a 67.5 degree head tube angle, it has a 498 millimeter reach, and it has a 436 millimeter chainstay. So you add all of that up and it comes to a 1223 millimeter wheelbase. The Ranger uses the CBF suspension design. It's designed by one of the Canfields. It has a bunch of voodoo magic that goes over my head, but the claim is that it's efficient no matter where you are in the stroke. So we're gonna put that to the test. And today I am riding a very custom build. We built this from the frame up. It's not an off-the-shelf build that you're going to be able to buy. We did keep it on the very cross-country side of things. We didn't go as trail as maybe some people. I actually have seen people putting coils on these, which I think that's missing the mark. You know, if that's the bike you want, buy that bike in the first place. At some point, you're trying to turn a bike into something it's not. So how does this thing ride out on the trail? Let's get into it.
It's pretty windy on the day I happen to be filming, so that's cool. This is a bit of a custom build. We kept it very XC rather than, you know, trail bike. So I think you could maybe go both ways on this bike, but we're about to see. All right, let's talk suspension here. Oh, this bike is short. It's kind of funny jumping. Feels like my little dirt jumper. It uses CBF, Canfield design, and it works some weird voodoo magic that goes way above my head, but it pedals really well. I think it strikes a really good balance between, you know, pedal bob or lack of, and still having some traction, still being able to smooth out the trail a bit. I really like the pedal platform on this. It makes this style of climbing where you got a lot of embedded rock a little smoother, a little more comfortable, without going so far that it's inefficient. I like this. Wow. All right. I guess this is it. That's rad. Okay. That was awesome. Really nimble. All right, let's talk a little bit geo here. The bike is short. You feel it. You feel that short wheelbase. On the uphills, I don't dislike that at all, especially on this kind of techie stuff with some tight corners and things. It makes getting around those fairly easy. Head tube feels steep. Steering feels really responsive. Definitely has that XC bike sharp, precise handling. I see the draw to this. This bike makes uphill pretty fun. I could kind of get on board with doing this every once in a while. Overall, pretty stoked on climbing on this thing. The more I climb, the more I like it. I don't quite trust the traction with these tires, so I'm understeering the corners by a lot. Riding tires like this will make you really work on your cornering skill. All right, so downhill, I'm feeling that short wheelbase as the very first thing. Helps it get around a corner a little bit if I could just get used to these tires. It gets up to speed quick out of a corner. I like that. A couple pedal strokes, you're going again. Suspension on this thing has that same feel as on the uphill where, you know, it is a little bit more forgiving, a little softer than some other XC bikes. Keeps you on the ground a little bit better, keeps you hooking up in the corners a bit better. So I think that's a pretty good call. having a little more forgiveness built into the bike isn't a bad thing. Yeah, I don't feel like I'm getting rattled to death on this kind of embedded rock. I don't know what to call it, like stubbly stuff. It's like little cobblestones maybe. Let's talk about the geo for a sec. Bike is short, I can feel it. It's not ultra stable or long. And the way that kind of comes across to me is like the butter zone, where you're balanced between the wheels on the bike. It's a little bit smaller, so you kind of have to be on it. Make sure your weight's in the right spot. You're gonna get penalized. But on the flip side of that, you know, that's where the quick, agile, responsive, maneuverable feel comes from. And this bike definitely has that. And I do think it gets a bit more forgiveness from that suspension. So it's not all, you know, sharp, pointy. There's some forgiveness to the bike. It's a little too windy to ride the, oh geez, it's way windy. It's too windy to ride the jumps trail. So we're gonna ride the wheels on the ground trail. And it kind of seems like even just keeping the wheels on the ground is gonna be a challenge. It is howling. Wow, okay, well, I think it's too windy. We're gonna call it a day, go get a bunch more riding on this somewhere else, and then go talk about it in the garage.
So starting off with the uphill. Uphill for me is usually the necessary evil to give me and my bike some potential energy. It gets us to the top of the hill so we can have fun going back down. The Ranger changed that a little bit for me. I don't normally enjoy the climbs all that much, but on this bike I kind of did. The bike goes uphill very well and it makes climbing enjoyable. Don't tell anyone I said that. So let's start with the star of the show. The suspension here was the best thing about the bike, up and downhill. The Ranger strikes a very good balance between traction and efficiency. I have a bit of an aversion to full suspension bikes that feel more like a hardtail because they're just too firm, too efficient. The Ranger isn't plush. It has 115 millimeters of rear travel. It can't really be that plush. But the initial stroke actually does feel pretty soft. That does lead to a tiny bit of pedal bob, but that's a small price to pay for the amount of traction and control that affords you on the climbs, especially when things get a little bit rocky and a little bit technical. On my test lap, the trail is just littered with embedded, pointy, sharp rocks. And having a smoother, softer suspension feel went a long way in making me climb smoother, which I think makes you faster. But it's not so soft and so inefficient that it just sucks to climb. I think it finds that perfect balance. On technical climbs, the Ranger did really, really well. That's where it really stands out above the rest. And I think it has a lot to do with the geometry. Because it's not a long bike, because it's not a slack bike, it's really quick and nimble. You're able to kind of weave in and out of rocks instead of having to go over everything because the bike's just too long. You come up to a tight little switchback and you're able to get around it. No problems. There was one bit of the climb in particular that was really steep, really rocky, and had a really tight turn at the top. I don't think I would have made it on another bike. The short wheelbase and the steep head tube angle on the Ranger was mostly positives on the climbs. There were a couple of places though where I found it was easy to get your weight either too far forward or too far back. That sweet spot where you're balanced between the wheels is smaller on a smaller bike. So there were a couple of times, you know, on steep climbs trying to get up over a ledge, I'd get my weight too far forward and the back wheel would slip out. I'm also a really tall guy, so I'm pretty sensitive to slack seat tube angles because my seat gets way up there and the higher it goes, the slacker it gets. On the Ranger, I noticed that I was having to reach forward for the bars just a little more than maybe I'd like. I felt a little bit stretched out, even with the saddle pretty far forward and a short stem. Before you tell me I'm on the wrong size, I'm not. The bike felt as small as I'd ever want a bike to feel. It's just that seated position because of a little bit slacker seat tube angle and me having giraffe legs, it did lead to me being a little stretched out. Shorter folks aren't going to be as affected by this. All right, jumping into the downhills. So for an XC bike, uphill is definitely the priority. You're gonna spend most of your time there. That's where you're gonna win or lose your races, but you can't completely disregard downhill performance, because XC races are on a loop, so whatever you go up, you got to come down. And Revel did a really good job of making sure this bike still goes downhill. Again, star of the show, suspension. That same soft off the top, soft initial stroke is what made the bike a little bit more forgiving. You know, the geometry is pretty sharp and pointy. It's very XC. It makes you really bring your A game. The suspension affords you a little bit of forgiveness to make a couple of mistakes and not get punished for it. Again, on the trail I filmed on, there was a ton of embedded little cobbles or pointy rocks. And normally on a short travel XC bike, you're gonna be bouncing around. You're gonna have the back wheel hanging up on that kind of stuff. And I just didn't. It was very smooth, it wasn't rattly, and it felt quick. I was able to just ride through all that stuff instead of getting bounced all around and slowing down. There were a couple of places where I ran out of talent in a spot where the bike wasn't designed to ride, and those were some scary moments. This bike isn't so forgiving though that you'll be able to get away with murder. I think the suspension feels a little bit more like a trail bike, but the geometry is what keeps this bike in the XC category for me. Again, steepest and shortest bike I've ridden in the last couple of years, which makes it very quick, responsive, and lively. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a bike with quicker, more agile, more lively handling than the Ranger. Where it differs from a lot of XC bikes, for me at least, is in how playful it is. Most XC bikes are about going fast and racing. This one's actually really fun. You can jump it, you can pump it, you can kind of goof around, and it feels a little bit more fun, a little bit more like a trail bike than it does an XC bike. The Ranger definitely feels at home on like cruisy blues and greens, on mellower terrain. You get into that bigger, nastier, rougher terrain, and that's really where you start to notice the shorter wheelbase. If you find yourself outside of that sweet spot, you're gonna know about it. So a couple of really quick comparisons here. Let's compare it to the Ibis XE. The XE felt a lot more stable. It's bigger. It wasn't quite as easy to get bounced around on rougher downhills. I think it climbs every bit as well as the Ranger. It's maybe more efficient, but it's not quite as nimble. So I think the Ranger will beat it in technical climbing or tight trails, but the XE and the Ranger, you put them both on a smooth road, and I think they're both gonna climb about the same. Let's also compare it to the Giant Trance 29. I rode this bike recently, so it definitely came to mind. I think the Trance actually might be a little bit more efficient, but it is bigger, it is longer, so again, on tighter, more technical trails, I think the Ranger's gonna take the cake. On the downhill, the Trance does have more travel and a longer wheelbase, so it is a little bit more stable. I think it's suited to a wider variety of more difficult terrain. And lastly, let's talk about the Transition Spur. It's been forever since I've owned this bike, but I owned one, so I rode it a lot, and I feel like I can compare the two. They're both kind of that XC trail, blur the lines type bike, but I don't think they could be at more opposite ends of a category. The Ranger is short, small, quick, nimble, and the Spur is long, slack-ish, and a lot more stable. While riding the Spur, I didn't feel the need to back down from bigger, nastier, scarier lines. I kind of rode it the same way I'd ride my big bike. The Ranger, I definitely would not do that. I do think the Ranger, though, will climb much better, you know, whether it's smooth and open or tight and technical. So, who is the Ranger for? This one's kind of obvious. It's for XC riders. If you want to race cross country or endurance events, or you just prefer to fight gravity rather than work with it, the Ranger is going to be a great bike for you. Like I said, it made climbing fun, and I don't normally enjoy climbing. So if you like climbing, I think this is a really good bike for you. And again, it doesn't completely sacrifice on downhill performance. That suspension is really, really nice on the downhill. All right, so one line bike review just to wrap this up. The Revel Ranger, making climbing fun since 2020. So thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.